Welcome to the Rancher's Voice, presented by the Montana Stockgrowers Association. I'm Jay Bodner, MSGA's Executive Vice President.
And I'm Raylee Honeycutt, Director of Natural Resources. Join us for conversations surrounding policy, the legislature, and issues that matter most to ranching families in Montana.
Welcome to this week's episode. This week we're going to touch a little bit on a review of some of the MSGA priority bills at the legislature. We are getting toward the end of the session, and we are focusing a lot on finishing up our critical bills, but then also looking at what some of the study bills are. We also do have an interview with Karen Budd-Falen, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the Biden administration 30 by 30 proposal, which us in agriculture are following very closely. We have a number of concerns with that, and so Karen is going to share a lot of her thoughts with us. So it's a great opportunity to listen to a real expert.
Yes, and as you listen, remember to subscribe to the Rancher's Voice, follow us on social, like, share, and comment on each episode, and email your questions to Kenny, Keni, at mtbeef.org. So we are going to jump in and talk about what's happening at the legislature. Rumor has it that we will be wrapped up this week, so it's looking promising. I saw a legislator posted on Facebook, so if it's Facebook official, it must be happening. So there are a few things that are happening. Of course, there are bills that still need to be heard. There's some study bills being introduced that are having hearings, but really it's all dependent upon all of the budget bills and having their final conferences and votes. And so as those happen throughout this week, as soon as those get done, we would anticipate the legislature to sine die and gavel out for the rest of the session. So we'll see. We'll keep you posted and watch on Facebook as we kind of have that information rolling out in real time. A couple of the MSGA priority bills that we wanted to highlight for you this week are first, House Bill 554. You've heard us chat about that quite a bit. This is the bill that would require legislative approval for national heritage areas. I am happy to report as of Monday morning that bill was passed by the legislature after having gone back to the House for an amendment, passed the legislature Monday morning, and will be headed to Governor Gianforte's desk in the very near future, which is very exciting. I know many people have voiced their support of this bill, as many people are worried about what ramifications would be if a national heritage area did come into our state. So keep very excited for that to pass. The second bill that's a priority bill for us is House Bill 660, which would be increasing funding for the Made in Montana program. That bill was heard last week in Senate Finance and Claims, and during that hearing, it was amended from the money rather than the money coming from the general fund. It was amended to come out of the Big Sky Economic Development Fund. With the amendments, that bill passed out of Finance and Claims with large support and will be heard on the Senate floor this week for its second and third reading, and really excited for that to continue moving on as well. The last bill I wanted to update you on is House Bill 306. This is in regards to the Fish and Game Commission's structure. It went to a Senate conference committee last week, where the conference committee ended up amending that bill. The language had read 2 landowners, and the committee amended it to say 3 landowners. It passed out of committee and is in its final hearings as well. So excited to see that we were able to get an additional landowner increased back into that bill.
Yeah, great. Also, just want to touch a little bit on the veterinary diagnostic lab and give you a quick update. So that is included in both House Bill 14, the long-range funding infrastructure package, and then also in House Bill 632, and that is the bill that will direct a lot of the federal ARPA money that is coming back from the federal government. So it's in both of those funding packages. We are think that it's in a pretty good position to actually get that bill, to get the lab funded and potentially built. So we're pretty excited about the movement we're seeing in the veterinary diagnostic lab.
I remember sitting at the beginning of session thinking, well, we'll just talk about it this session, and next session maybe we'll get it. So to have it in two funding mechanisms is really exciting for, I think, the industry as a whole.
Yeah, and I think it did put us in a pretty good position originally, just with that we were going to bring some money to the table to help fund that. Potentially, this could be funded strictly out of just government dollars too. So we'll see as this does get finalized, and hopefully this week potentially. In addition to that, we have been working very closely with the legislature to put some additional dollars, that would be about $200,000, into House Bill 2. That's the main funding bill for the government. And within that would go toward the Department of Livestock's budget for the CIS program, or the Cooperative Interstate Shipment Program. And just as a reminder for that program, we've talked a lot about meat packing opportunities for producers in Montana. So this CIS program, it does promote the expansion of business opportunities for state inspected meat establishments. So we think that there's an opportunity there to continue to build on what we have in Montana and provide more opportunity for not only these state inspected plants, but individual producers. So we're pretty thankful that is moving forward right now too. In addition to that, bison, we have seen some positive movements. So we have House Bill 302. That was allowed county commissioners to have a say in bison relocation into their county. And then House Bill 318, this would clarify the definition of bison and what a wild bison is. So both of these bills have passed the legislature, and they will be headed to the governor's desk. So there has been a lot of effort over a lot of years to get these bison bills moving. And so we actually have a great opportunity now to get both of these bills signed.
Yeah, so as the week kind of wraps up, we'll be able to give a really thorough kind of briefing on where the legislature lands in our podcast next week, and excited to see a lot of the bills and priorities that our MSGA members have brought forward having positive movement, and many of them headed to the governor's desk, which is exciting.
It is. So now I'd like to introduce our interviewee for the week. We have with us Karen Budd-Falen, and I think Karen is very well known, I think, within our industry. But for those that do not know her, she is an attorney down in Wyoming, Cheyenne, Wyoming, and they have the Budd-Falen law firm there. She's very well versed in a lot of federal land issues, certainly involved in many of the issues that deal with ranch families. They have a ranch themselves. She's been involved really pretty significantly in the Public Lands Council. I've known her for a number of years, and she's been a real resource as we work through issues at the Public Lands Council and within that organization. She was also within the Department of Interior within the last administration, and it was great to have a very strong ally in that administration as we kind of advocated for ranchers and those that use that are administered within the Department of Interior. So with that, welcome, Karen.
Well, I'd like to welcome everybody, and we have a special guest with us today. We have Karen Budd-Falen. I think anybody that has dealt with any natural resource issue is familiar with Karen Budd-Falen and their law firm. She has a great history of working on behalf of farmers and ranchers. And Karen, maybe just for some of those folks that haven't had the opportunity to meet you yet, maybe you can just talk a little bit about, give a little background on yourself.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate getting to talk to Montana Stockgrowers Association. As Jay said, my name is Karen Budd-Falen. I grew up on a 5th generation working cattle ranch in Big Piney, Wyoming, which is about 150 miles north of Rock Springs and 150 miles south of Jackson. it was one of those places that my fifth great grandfather was trailing cattle and got stuck there in the winter and decided to stay. And it's one of the coldest places in the nation. So every year during calving, we think, why did you pick Big Piney, Wyoming to stay and try to raise a cow-calf herd? I got my undergraduate degree and my law degree from the University of Wyoming. When people ask me why I picked being a cowboy lawyer, I tell them it's because my dad decided that my sisters and I really needed to help with the ranching operation. And he said to stay in the ranching business, he needed a lawyer, a vet, and a banker. And my sisters and I went, okay, Daddy. And that's what he got out of the deal. So I've been working on livestock issues and representing farmers and ranchers and private property owners for, I hate to say it, 30 years now. And I just got back from a 2-year appointment for President Trump, working at Department of Interior, specifically dealing with issues regarding the National Park Service, Endangered Species Act, wildlife refuges, and I was on the writing team for the Council of Environmental Quality rules on NEPA. And I am very happy to be back in Wyoming.
Well, thank you. And we did appreciate your efforts in DC. It was a welcome appointment when you got selected for that position, because it's nice to have a person with your knowledge and background in Department of Interior. And we're certainly seeing a lot of new faces there nowadays, and nobody necessarily that has that ag and ranching background. And I think that's going to be sorely missed when we start to dive into many of these issues that we are going to be facing over the next few years.
I would agree with that. It was interesting. I met a lot of really fine people working for Department of Interior, but when I would talk about the realities of a cow-calf operation or owning land in Wyoming, I have to tell you, very few people understood that concept. And so a lot of the reason I think they asked me to go back was because I've got a working knowledge of the difficulties of owning land, of being a small business, of living in a state where the federal government owns so much of the property. And I think that gave me a really unique perspective. And you can be a fine person and have great ideas, but having a legitimate working knowledge just gives you a whole better background, I think, to work at Interior.
Yeah. We would definitely agree with that. And Jay mentioned there's a lot of new faces back there in DC, but we are now seeing that there is a lot of new policy coming out of the new administration as well. And really, we wanted to chat with you about President Biden's executive order on tackling climate change, and specifically the 30 by 30 plan. So I know this has been a conversation. It's in the news and in ag publications quite a bit recently, but for folks who may not be that familiar with the plan, can you just give us a 30,000-foot high level overview of what 30 by 30 is?
Sure. So 30 by 30 was an executive order specifically dealing with climate change that President Biden signed on January 27th of 2021. And the executive order overall view is that there may not be a crisis at the border between us and Mexico, but there is a climate crisis. And so he signed this executive order that affects every branch of government on how to actually deal with what he calls the climate crisis. And that includes everything from defense, national security, foreign and domestic policy, farming, ranching, oil and gas, coal. Everything is affected by this executive order. It's been a lot in the news about the war on coal. This 30 by 30 plan revives that. It's been a lot in the news about how there is a pause on oil and gas leasing. That is all part of 3030. And specifically what I was looking at was how would this affect agriculture, whether it's farming, whether it's ranching, whether it's grazing permits on federal lands. And so my focus on reviewing it was how does this affect agriculture in the United States? And it's got some pretty profound effect. Now you got to remember, as an executive order, this is not a rule of law. So the order doesn't mandate anything, but it tells the federal agencies that when they issue decisions, they have to consider certain parts of climate change. Now, the one that I focused on for this first installment, and I'll actually be writing more about the 30 by 30 because it's a very long executive order and it touches a lot of agriculture. The first that I wrote is the land acquisition program. And under the executive order, the concern was that only 12% of the land right now owned by the federal government is protected from climate change. And the goal under the executive order is to acquire or stop use of another 440 million acres of land to protect from climate change. 440 million acres, if you're trying to picture that in your head, is twice the size of Texas. And so the executive order directs that by 2030, which is 8 years from now, the federal government needs to own or stop additional use on 440 million acres. And so that was the part that I focused on. In my next segment, I'm going to focus on USDA programs, because one of the things the executive order talks about is farmers voluntarily doing things that like no-till farming or that kind of thing that are considerate of climate change. My concern with that is y'all remember the 65-mile-an-hour speed limit, and how I remember that as a kid, and driving across Wyoming at 65 miles an hour is really difficult because there's a long way between places. But that was also a, quote, voluntary program, because Department of Transportation said that unless you mandate a lower speed limit, you don't get highway transportation funds. And the court ruled that was voluntary. So my concern with getting all this acreage for farmers and including it is how voluntary is that going to be? Because voluntary with the federal government does not mean the same as a voluntary agreement with your next door neighbor. So that's part of it. Another part of it is a concern with the regulation that we wrote at Department of Interior, giving local governments a very big say in critical habitat designation. This order takes aim at the local government involvement in that. So the order has a lot of overall general goals in it. And I think that agriculture needs to be really aware of what those goals are so that they can participate and understand what could be happening to them in the next 4 years.
Great. Karen, you kind of mentioned as you talked a little bit about the land acquisition piece. And so now we have the Land and Water Conservation Fund, who's certainly well funded, and a high percentage of that is kind of mandated going toward land acquisitions. And so do these two pieces kind of fit together with the 30 by 30 and maybe that goal of land acquisition, or even maybe mandating easements? How do you see that maybe playing out?
So the land and water acquisition fund, or the Land and Water Conservation Fund, has been around for a long time, maybe 20 years. It's been quite a while, but it was never permanently funded by Congress. And there was always an argument because the Land and Water Conservation Fund can be used to acquire private land. But depending on whether you're Republican or Democrat or how you feel about acquiring more land by the federal government, there's never been permanent funding. So last year, under the Great American Outdoors Act, Congress passed permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And I'm going to have to put on my glasses because I can't read the number, and I do periods and commas. I don't do numbers. So the Land and Water Conservation Fund will every year have an appropriation of $900 million. And one of the things, like I said, they can do with land and water conservation money is acquire private property for the federal government. Now, when we were at Department of Interior, one of the things that we worked on was making sure that the federal government was not harming counties and states by acquiring more land, because as you know, when the federal government owns property, there's no property taxes paid on it. There's no income tax paid on it. People aren't employed by working on the federal land, particularly under the 30-30, because under Biden's 30 by 30, no use can occur if you're going to protect that property for climate change. And so during the Trump administration, we passed a requirement that said that if the government was going to acquire more land, it had to have the agreement of the states and the counties that were involved in that land acquisition. And we thought that way, if the government is going to acquire a whole bunch more land, say in a county where the government already owns 75% of the county, that is going to have a very negative economic impact. And we wanted the counties to be involved. But what Biden has done is now eliminated the requirement of state and local government agreement for federal land purchase in the counties. And I think that is going to be, I mean, in some counties, it's going to be fine. The county is going to welcome it. Some counties are going to hate it because it's going to really harm their tax base. But now there is no longer a mandatory county voice. And I think that is a huge problem. I have always believed, and I believe most your listeners believe, that the government closest to the people is the best form of government, that they understand their county, that they know what they need as a county, and that philosophy does not seem to be present in the new administration.
So I have a couple different questions kind of swirling around in my head. So I'm going to start off with, this may be somewhat of a loaded question, but you mentioned the 440 million acres that would need to be, acquired or put under this plan to meet the goal. In your opinion, is that even attainable?
Congress is going to have to appropriate a lot of money to be able to attain this goal. I mean, the 900 million in Land and Water Conservation Fund isn't going to come anywhere close to being able to buy 440 million acres in the next 8 years. So I'm not sure that it's attainable. One of the things that really worries me, especially for the Western states like Montana, is that we already have a significant portion of federal lands, Forest Service land, BLM land, Park Service land, that's considered multiple use. So you can graze cattle on it. You can cut timber. You can do oil and gas and all that stuff. And but right now under 30-30, only 12% of that federal land protects biodiversity. And in the Biden view, there can be absolutely no use to protect biodiversity. So what I'm really concerned is that to get to this 440 million acres, one of the things that the Biden administration is going to do is start way restricting multiple uses on the federal land, such as your livestock grazing permits, to be able to get toward this 440 million acre goal. They can do that without spending any congressional money, and I think that should be a big concern. Because we know that well-managed livestock operations on federal lands is absolutely environmentally friendly and protective and protects from catastrophic wildfire. And there's a million reasons to allow grazing on federal lands. But even well-managed grazing under the Biden view does not contribute to biodiversity. So those uses will have to stop.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, we certainly understand that in many of these Western states and certainly Montana and Wyoming in particular, that many of these ranches that hold these federal grazing leases, it's a critical part of the operation. And without that grazing, many of these ranchers are probably at risk of simply going out of business, which will have a tremendous impact on not only states, but agriculture in general. And that is a pretty concerning potential for this plan to produce, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. And it was interesting when I was nominated to go back to Department of Interior, my family ranch has BLM and Forest Service grazing permits because that ranch in Big Piney can't survive without those permits. It's too cold. We don't have enough land. I mean, your ranchers all have that same story. And so I was explaining to the administration that I can't just give up the permits because that would require we sell the ranch. There's just no two ways around it. And I don't know that even in the Trump administration, I got people to understand that connection between the private property and the grazing permits and how you can't have a viable ranch operation in so many Western states without those permits. And if they didn't understand it in the Trump administration, where they were favorable to what we do out here for a living, it makes me really nervous in a Biden administration that they simply don't understand this connection. And they don't understand that if you don't have grazing permits, you don't have a ranch. And in Sublette County, where I grew up, it is very pretty. I mean, big mountains. We got the Wyoming range on one side and the Wind River range on the other side. And so we could sell that private land, but they're going to put houses on it. And how much of biodiversity and protection of the ecosystem are you going to have with, 40-acre ranchettes on all that land? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But unless you're involved in it, unless you've grown up that way, or unless you've really educated yourself, people just don't understand that concept.
So do you feel that private property is key in hitting these goals? Or as you mentioned earlier, it's a timing thing. If we volunteer our private property too soon, that may put us at more risk than not. So where do you think private property plays into this mix?
I'm really worried that, well, let me say it this way. And I hate to sound like an alarmist, but I'm concerned that if we start volunteering to give up use, if we start volunteering private property, I mean, there's no give on the other side. It's not like we can come together as a community and say, okay, how about if we all collectively give you, 10,000 acres somewhere that you guys will go away and leave the rest of us alone. That's not how it's going to work. I mean, I think that I'm really, really concerned that there's not going to be much give here. And I understand that a private landowner has got the right to sell to whoever the heck he wants. And if my neighbor wants to sell to the federal government or do a long-term conservation easement, that's your property. I can't say anything, and I completely support that. But I also think you have to think about what is it going to do to the counties and the tax base? What is it going to do to the state and the tax base? And I firmly believe that America provides food source for the world. And it concerns me if we would take land out of production. I mean, I don't want to get our food from a foreign country. I don't want to get it from, our beef from somewhere else. Truth is, I'd rather have you buy you want to buy some really good steaks, you should call my husband and I. We will help you out. But it just, I don't know that there's anything that we can give.
Karen, I'd like to maybe pivot a little. You mentioned early on about critical habitat, but even looking at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so recently they did come out with a decision not to move forward on grizzly bear delisting, you know, and even though that we've met the recovery goals for years and years and years, and how do you see that issue playing out in the near future? Or will we see any movement in that or any of these delisting opportunities?
The truth is I am worried about that. If you look at the way we delisted wolves and you think about how that came about, what the Fish and Wildlife Service did initially was just delist wolves in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana based on their state plans. And then when Trump was in office, we worked really hard on delisting the rest of the population of wolves, except for red wolves in the very eastern United States and Mexican wolves on the Arizona-New Mexico border. With grizzly bear, the latest 5-year plan didn't look at pockets where the bears had recovered, like Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. It looked at grizzly bears across the United States and said that you haven't met recovery goals for every state in the nation for grizzly bears. And if that's the way they're going to view grizzly recovery, I am very worried that we're not going to be able to get them recovered or get them delisted. So one of the things that I've been sort of thinking about is how could we structure a petition to do a distinct population segment for Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, the places where we have met and far exceeded grizzly numbers, to try to force the Fish and Wildlife Service, instead of looking across the board at the whole United States, look at these areas where they've recovered and turn the management through delisting back to the states. Because it's, as I said earlier, in my view, these species are best managed by the state that they're in, because every state is different, the land is different, the populations are different. And I think the state game and fish are in a much better position to manage these animals than is the federal government with a across the board, one size fits all plan, which is the way Fish and Wildlife is looking at it now.
Yeah, and we would agree 100%. And I know there has been some legislation introduced to actually delist them in Congress, but we know that legislation is going to be met with a lot of opposition.
Yes.
So Karen, kind of as we wrap up, based off of, your experience that you've had in DC and you being, from Wyoming and a ranching family, are there other topics or other issues that we should, our ranchers should be keeping top of mind as we kind of look at what this new administration is beginning to roll out and legislation that's coming down the pipeline?
I think there's a couple of things. One of the things, if you're looking at the federal lands issues, resource management plans are going to be key. And I would make sure that your local governments are ready and willing and totally participating in those. If you look at the regulations that we did from the Council of Environmental Quality for the new NEPA regs, which applies to every major federal action, we added additional processes for local governments to be involved in those decisions. And so I would really push on your local governments to say, you can describe the tax base, you can describe the socioeconomics, the environment better than the federal government. Even if the federal government is completely well-intentioned, they don't understand what it's like to live in Laramie County, Wyoming, or where your rural ranches are. And so that's the first thing, is I would really gin up my local governments to be involved. I think one of the other things that you should look at is one of the things that Trump said is that I'm not going to do things by executive order. We are going to do rulemaking, which means that Biden administration has to undo what we did through rulemaking. They can't just say, oh, sign an executive order, stroke of the pen, change it all around. That was fully intentional on our part. So I would really watch those new rulemakings that are coming out. The Biden administration has asked the courts to send the CEQ rules on NEPA back to CEQ for a further review. That will have to be through a public process. I'm sure there will be a lot of news and articles about that, but we have to be involved. You've got to make your voices known on rulemaking, which I think is going to be critical. And I think you're going to see a lot of that coming down the pipe as we move through the next 4 years.
Well, I think those are some great tips, and certainly appreciate your thoughts on that, because I think it is important for our folks to make sure that us as organizations and individuals, we stay abreast of that so we can participate and make sure that we do get those comments submitted and be on the front lines of participating in that, so we don't have some of those potential harmful rules coming forward. So I would just like to once again thank Karen for joining us today. I think for all our listeners, that she is a wealth of information and has great experience with protecting agriculture. It was certainly shown today and through her experiences, many positions that she's held, not only in private practice, but within the government. So Karen, once again, I'd like to just thank you for joining us today. And it's been certainly beneficial on our part to be able to visit with you today.
Thank you. I would be happy to visit with you anytime. Agriculture is the greatest, absolutely the greatest profession in the world, even better than being a lawyer. And I just want to encourage your people to be proud of what they're doing, to stand up for their farms and ranches. And I thank organizations like Montana Stockgrowers for really being on the front lines and educating people and being involved in these issues.
Well, once again, we'd like to thank Karen Budd-Falen for joining us this week. As you heard, she is certainly an expert when it comes to a number of these issues, and we very much appreciate her thoughts. And as we look at the 30 by 30 proposal and how the potential impacts are going to be to ranchers and agriculture in Montana and across the West. And so it's nice to have somebody of her breadth and knowledge that can look at that and review that. And we're glad that she's on our team.
Definitely. And we'd like to thank you all for joining us as well. So make sure to continue to subscribe to The Rancher's Voice. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And make sure to like, share, and comment on each episode. We hope you have a great week, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody.